I'm Christy Shriver, and we're here to discuss books that have changed the world and have changed us.
And I'm Gary Shriver, and this is the How to Love Lit podcast. This episode, we will conclude our three-part series on John Donne, the metaphysical poet, Anglican preacher. In episode 1, we featured the side of Donne that arguably has become the most popular over the years, his mock serious side, Jack Donne, as some affectionately call him. In that episode, we featured the famous poem, The Flea. In episode 2, we discussed Donne's personal romance with Anne Moore, his secret marriage, and the fallout from it, while also considering his serious love poetry, and some would say some of the most romantic ever written in the English language.
I put myself in that group. I do think his is some of the most romantic love poetry that I know anything about.
Today, we consider Donne in the context of his religious works, the works of the respectable Dr. Donne, and we will begin by highlighting his Holy Sonnets. But of course, we could not end without featuring at least a little of his sermons, and so we will end with an excerpt from Meditation 17, The Tolling of the Bells.
You know, we ended our last discussion with the death of Anne Donne and talked about how that was a turning point in his life and turning point in his writing in many ways. But honestly, that was a little bit of an oversimplification of a process that was highly personal and highly spiritual and took a long time. This episode begins by jumping a little bit back into those difficult years when Donne was financially and professionally distressed due to his decision to marry Anne in such a controversial way. And the bulk of Donne's religious poetry seems to have been written during those turbulent years, most notably what we call today the Holy Sonnets. Now, that's not to say the bulk of his writing, his religious writing, comes from that period. But when we talk about the poetry, the religious poetry, that's just a small part of his religious writing.
Again, the issue of when each poem was written is complicated, and it's complicated by the fact that none of it was published during his lifetime or even with his knowledge, and it lends a little uncertainty as to the precise context, But if we assume that his biographers are at the very least mostly correct, it lends power to Donne's words, and knowing the incredible challenges of his life makes these poems more meaningful and really more relatable. And these are not theoretical exercises of religious theory. I mean, these are expressions of a groaning soul attempting to make sense of the paradox of being both human flesh and spirit.
Yes, and we know for a fact that the 19 poems that today we know as the Holy Sonnets are some of his most personal and intimate pieces, and they express serious spiritual struggles, Christian struggles born out of his lived experience both as a Catholic and as a Protestant. A lot of what these sonnets discuss is death, illness of the body, illness of the soul. We might call that anxiety or depression today, but Donne was up against incredible life obstacles, extreme physical, financial, social, professional, spiritual pressure, and they're all bearing down on him at the exact same time, as these things always do. He was looking to God aggressively and asking serious questions. What are we supposed to understand in a spiritual sense when so much bears down on this? Is there a God? Does he hate me? Have I pushed the limits of acceptable behavior beyond a point of redemption? Am I paying for my sins? How do I even control my impulses, the ones that are sinful, the ones that keep hurting me? Do I deserve all the trouble I've run up against? Is there grace to get me out of this trouble? I mean, most think Donne wrote the sonnets, the Holy Sonnets, at least most of them, between 1608 and 1609. So this is right in the middle of this difficult period. Remember, he and Anne, they had married in 1601. And ever since then, Donne had had few professional prospects. But finances, that was just part of the problem. After their marriage, Anne bore a child every year during those first 5 years. By 1611, though, 3 of his children under the age of 10 had died, and Donne couldn't even afford to bury them. So personally, think about the heartache. Donne's fall from professional grace forced him to take work wherever he could from people way less prestigious than the ones that he'd been associating with just a few years before.
One of his first patrons was a mid-level aristocrat by the name of Sir Robert Drury. And Drury, although ambitious, never quite made it. He never got a political position, and so neither did Donne.
And yet, Donne wrote wonderful poetry for him, most notably 2 anniversaries and an elegy for Drury's 14-year-old daughter, Elizabeth, who had died tragically. Donne never even met Elizabeth, but he wrote about her in such glorious terms that Ben Jonson criticized Donne, saying what Donne wrote about Elizabeth Drury would only be appropriate if he were writing about the Virgin Mary, which I bring up, number one, to show that he's still doing things with excellence, but also he's doing excellent things that important people are still reading.
Well, and Donne defends it. Donne countered that particular criticism of Jonson's along with a lot more who had a problem with the anniversaries, saying the context of his writing was Elizabeth's death. But he was making observations about the frailty of life and the progression of the soul that extended beyond really any one person.
True. And that work that you're referencing is still admired today, and it is beautiful. My point is, Donne was essentially a writer for hire, and that obviously could get sketchy. For example, Robert Carr, who is a titled person, close friend of King James, paid Donne to be a pen on reserve. And when the time came, he commissioned him to write a poem for his wedding. That in itself sounds innocuous, except it wasn't innocuous. He was marrying a divorcee, which in itself would have been scandalous, but this particular situation was high profile and very controversial. Donne did it, but obviously with reluctance. He did not need one more wedding scandal in his own life. I can only imagine that he thought more than once, what have I done? I used to have the best gig in town, and now look what's happened.
So we get a man who is struggling at home and struggling professionally after experiencing success. And this brings him to feeling, just crushed mentally, emotionally, and or spiritually, depending on how you define those terms. And we know he struggled because it's in his own words. And one book he wrote in 1608, he entitled Bienthanatos. And the word Bienthanatos is a Greek word which means violent death. And in it, he questions the sinfulness of suicide, and, no version of Christianity endorses suicide for any reason. And for the Christian, the ultimate gift of God is life, and life should be protected at all costs and at all times, no exceptions ever. And Donne questions this fundamental tenet of Christianity. Donne would later admit that his thoughts of suicide were personal.
And of course, we're glad he was able to walk himself through those dark days, which brings us to the Holy Sonnets. The Holy Sonnets come out of that period, and they also question. It's important to understand that the Holy Sonnets are not instructional, which is something that I think a lot of people don't understand. You consider, this is a preacher. Of course, his writings are going to be instructional, but he doesn't write like that. Well, actually, he does write like that after he becomes a preacher, but not in the sonnets. These poems are before he gets to that place in his life. They ask questions. They don't answer them. A lot of scholars argue that they form a sequential line of reasoning. Other critics argue that they don't. I think you could probably read them both ways. We're only going to look at 2, so obviously we're not going to be able to follow a line of reasoning linking the sonnets together. But even if we did, and I do think especially if you're a Christian, they're interesting to read that way, it matters to understand that Donne didn't write them to offer theological teachings. They explore different dimensions of the problems of being sick, of death, of sin, what it means to be a person of flesh and blood, what it means to be a person with a soul that outlasts flesh and blood. The sonnets, as pieces of rhetoric, have no intended audience, except for maybe himself or just a few close friends. They're about spiritual dilemmas that Donne will wrestle with and think about really for the rest of his life. These are the same dilemmas everyone has to address. It doesn't matter your religious tradition. It doesn't matter your independence of thought. But Donne understands in obviously personal ways that there are quite a few obvious paradoxes embedded in the human experience. There are problems with being human, and they're not easy to resolve. They're not easy to understand, even if you have a guiding sacred text like the Bible. For example, and these are some of his questions, If we are made by God for eternity, what is the purpose of death and suffering? Why should we care about sin or violating God's natural law on our planet? What is the role of grace in this world? What is the role of Christ's sacrifice on the cross and the resurrection?
Which, from a historical perspective is fascinating. I mean, here we have a man who was raised Catholic in an extremely turbulent time in British history. In the Protestant tradition at this time, every single important voice was extremely Calvinistic, which is extremely harsh in very different ways than Catholicism. And Catholicism offered a path to salvation by works that helped you appease the wrath of God, and Calvinism preached salvation by grace. But they believed that only a few people were elected by grace, and your works were a demonstration of God's grace in your life. And both modes of existence put a lot of pressure on the individual, and both were clear human interpretations of a sacred text, and Donne accepted both, except in part, and it's why he could never be dogmatic about theology, and that's what King James liked about him. And C.S. Lewis would later say Donne's religious writing develops in unexpected and even tormented fashion, which to me is incredibly honest of Donne and helpful. His honest contemplation leads him to a complete reversal of religion, something not to be taken lightly. But in his Protestantism, he speaks of grace in a different way, and it made him a popular preacher. And there are some critics that suggest that he converted just for political advancement, but I kind of find that hard to believe. He wrestled with himself, and maybe you could say he wrestled with God. There's evidence from outside sources that Donne practiced something called Ignatian contemplation, which was a rigorous, very emotional, often and even turbulent spiritual exercise, which is what, I kind of describe as spiritual wrestling.
Well, agreed. And so let's read a couple of these. Even if you aren't a Christian, there's much to admire, and you can identify with these. It's full of passion for life, a pureness to be a good person, a better person. It's nice to think that this is what is inside of us as humans, and even if this isn't your personal faith. So let's begin with Sonnet 1. Gary, read for us this one. And he's speaking to God. The first word of the entire sonnet sequence is thou, which matters in a very important way. So the word thou, that's an archaic word. We don't use it anymore. Most of us know that it means you. But what has been lost over the years is the understanding that the word thou is a familiar term. In English, we don't use the familiar term anymore. Other languages do, like Spanish. They make a difference. And so let me explain it this way. In Spanish, the formal word for you is usted. So if you're talking to your teacher, an older person, a person of higher rank, you address them as usted. But if you're talking to your mom, your dad, your friend, you'll say tú. The word tú implies a certain intimacy. Thou in English is like the Spanish word tú. It's archaic, so we don't use it anymore. We've lost that, but it's intimate. It's not formal. You is the formal form of address. Thou is intimate. You denotes distance, respect. Thou devotes a close relationship. Notice that in the Holy Sonnets, sometimes Donne references God as thou, meaning he's leaning into that personal relationship. But there are other times he uses the formal you. He's feeling distant to God. There's a barrier, a respect perhaps. It's something to notice, and it tells us what some things mean. But if we look at the very first one, it doesn't start with you. It starts with the intimate thou. So this is Holy Sonnet number 1.
Thou hast made me, and shall thy work decay? Repair me now, for now mine end doth haste. I run to death, and death meets me as fast, and all my pleasures are like yesterday. I dare not move my dim eyes any way. Despair behind, and death before doth cast such terror, and my feeble flesh doth waste by sin in it, which it towards hell doth weigh. Only thou art above, and when towards thee by thy leave I can look, I rise again. But our old subtle foe so tempteth me, that not 1 hour myself I can sustain. Thy grace may wing me to prevent his art, and thou, like adamant, draw mine iron heart.
So what we need to understand first is that this is a sonnet. We're back to that courtly love tradition. The Italian poet Petrarch made the sonnet famous. They're almost always about love, and in Petrarch's case, specifically unrequited love. Sonnets follow a very organized and structured form. The meter is consistent. It's iambic pentameter. Ba-dum, ba-dum, ba-dum. This is a very highly ordered form. It's interesting to understand that because Donne's love poetry, when he's talking about his love for women in general or his true love in particular, does not use this tightly structured form. But when he's talking about love of God, he uses this convention. In Petrarchian sonnets, the rhyme scheme is also very controlled. So that means every line ends with a rhyme. And in this case, or in Petrarch's case, it ends A-B-B-A, A-B-B-A, C-D-E, C-D-E. So what do we see here? We see that the sonnet is divided in half. The first 8 lines present a problem. A-B-B-A, A-B-B-A. That's one half. The 6 lines that follow present the resolution. You know, other poets have followed this model. They've played around with the form, changed it maybe, notably Shakespeare. He changed the format to A, B, A, B, C, D, C, D, E, D, E, D, F, F. And what he did is instead of dividing the poem into 2 groups, he divides it in 3, and then a 2-line kind of summing up thing there at the end. It makes the poem more flexible. It allows the poet to talk about more than one thing, if you want to think of it that way. So Donne takes these ideas and he kind of combines the Petrarchian sonnet with elements of the Shakespearean sonnet. First of all, this is definitely about love, love from God, love to God. But God's love is ordered. It's highly ordered. But listen to this opening question. It's very strong. It's strong language, but it's intimate language. He's challenging God's omniscience. Thou hast made me, and shall thy work decay? In other words, look at me. You made me, and look what's happening to me. I'm decaying. There's a sense of begging God here.
Of course, historically, death and decay were all around Donne, more than it is for us today. And he lived through the plague multiple times, but the plague was not the only thing killing people during his lifetime. And there was typhus and smallpox and influenza and dysentery, and malnutrition was a problem, and medicine was not safe and often lethal itself. And basically, anytime you got sick, death was a lingering possibility.
And so he continues, repair me now, for now my end doth haste. I run to death, and death meets me as fast. And so obviously that's the problem. I'm running to death, and at the same time, death is running at me. I really like that phrase, because that's exactly how disease feels. Because naturally we run towards death, but when you're sick, death is coming at you. Let's finish the octave, or the 8 lines. And he says this, all my pleasures are like yesterday. I dare not move my dim eyes any way. Despair behind, death before, doth cast such terror, and my feeble flesh doth waste by sin in it, which it towards hell doth weigh. So he's looking down and he's despairing. In fact, he doesn't want to look in any direction, he says, because when he does, he sees death. But beyond just the physical aspect of death, Donne notes the problem is beyond physical. What about his spirit? For the Christian, the body and the soul, they're connected. We sin in our bodies, but that affects not just our bodies, it affects our spirits. He's considering all the things wrong in his life, and it's affecting his body. But it's not just affecting his body. Hell is looming. And then we move to the sextate. In other words, the last 6 lines, because this is the answer. This is the resolution. And this part of the poem, in these lines, instead of looking down, Donne is going to look up. Only thou art above, and when towards thee by the leave I can look, I rise again. But our old subtle foe so tempteth me, that not 1 hour myself I can sustain. Thy grace may win me to prevent his art, and thou like adamant draw mine iron heart. And so we see that Sonnet 1, by looking up, he finds hope.
I definitely see the influence of Calvinism here. He feels he can't go 1 hour by himself, and lots of Calvinists are saying similar things during this time. But even before that, it reminds me of the struggles that St. Paul talks about in the New Testament book of Romans, when he talks about the side of him that does things that he will later regret doing, but at the time seemed like a good idea. And Donne says, I can't sustain myself for a single hour, but God's grace, like an adamant, when I see that word adamant, I think of X-Men and adamantium. It's a vivid metaphor. He's saying God is drawing him with a metal so strong it only exists in mythology and in X-Men stories.
I'm sure that's what he was thinking of, the X-Men stories.
Is he a little bit ahead of his time in that regard? I mean, that's a comforting thought.
Adamant's been around a while.
Yeah.
Well, it is. And we have Sonnet 1. And so that's the first sonnet. And all of them are going to be kind of like this same general pattern. You have the same structure. You have the same groaning of the soul. He's talking about different ideas, but they're all kind of connected to the same idea of suffering and death and our experience between the two, until we get to probably what is the most famous Holy Sonnet, Holy Sonnet 10. Everything that we said about Sonnet 1, again, applies to 10. There's a similar rhyme scheme. He's going to use the second person familiar thou, but pay attention. In this case, instead of referencing God as thou and speaking to God in intimate terms, he talks to death in intimate terms. He is very familiar with this foe.
Death, be not proud, though some have called thee mighty and dreadful, for thou art not so. For those whom thou thinkest thou dost overthrow die not. Poor death, nor yet canst thou kill me. From rest and sleep, which but thy pictures be, much pleasure, then from thee much more must flow. And soonest our best men with thee do go, rest of their bones and souls delivery. Thou art slave to fate, chance, kings, and desperate men, and dost with poison, war, and sickness dwell, and poppy or charms can make us sleep as well, and better than thy stroke, why swellest thou then? One short sleep past, we wake eternally, and death shall be no more. Death, thou shalt die.
So obviously this is an apostrophe. That's that literary device when you talk to something that can't talk back. He's talking to death. Death's not talking back. Death is mighty and dreadful and proud. But he's pointing out the paradox for death from the Christian perspective. Because for the Christian, and this is why Christians wear crosses on their necks, death was killed. Christ overcame death. And that, of course, is why Donne in Valediction Forbidding Mourning says that virtuous men whisper to their souls to go, and they go mildly. They're not dying as in becoming extinct, or they're not dying in the sense that they're going to some other place where they have to live with their own inner demons for all of eternity. The Bible speaks of death as falling asleep, and you wake up with a resurrected body that's not subject anymore to death, not subject to the mighty and dreadful and prideful nature of death. He goes on to say, death has the worst friends and associates. Fate, chance, kings, desperate people, war, poison, sickness, drugs, hexes. And yet, in spite of all those things, they can't get to us because one short sleep, bam, death shall be no more. Death shall die.
There are 19 of these holy sonnets.
Yes, and they're all, very dramatic. And some of them, the language is quite graphic, especially when you consider that they're religious poems.
So we mentioned last week that Donne finally took orders on the insistence of King James in January of 1615. And in 1617, Anne died, leaving him with 7 children. In 1621, Donne was made Dean of St. Paul's Cathedral. In the late November of 1623, this would have been his 8th year as an Anglican minister. Donne gets sick. Some historians have said it was typhoid fever. Others have just called it a spotted fever. Either way, Donne was bedridden for over 2 weeks, and he was examined by 3 doctors. And the greater miracle is not that he survived his spotted fever, but that he survived his doctors. I mean, the treatments were terrifying during that time period. From our perspective, they were nonsensical. For example, one treatment was to cut pigeons in half and to hold the bleeding halves to the soles of Donne's feet.
You wonder what they thought was happening, but
science.
Yeah, really. In the weeks that followed his recovery, he penned a book today that we call the Devotions. Actually, the name is Devotions Upon Emergency Occasions and Several Steps in My Sickness.
That's a lot of words.
Hence Devotions. But it's a collection of 23 devotions. There's one meditation for every day that he was sick. So they're organized like this. There's a meditation followed by an expostulation is what he calls it. It's where Donne debates God, and then there's a prayer. So the meditation, which is really just personal observations, and then there's the expostulation and prayer, and those are addressed to God. But they record, each one a single medical episode. In general, they're not easy to read, but I think you'll recognize this one. It's his most favorite. In particular, this is one where he reflects lying in bed and listening to church bells ring. And as they would in those days when people died, and he kind of disassociates himself from his body, and he wonders for whom the bell is really tolling. We're going to read this meditation in 3 parts so we can break it up and talk about some of these very famous metaphors, some of which you may recognize.
Perchance he for whom this bell tolls may be so ill as that he knows not it tolls for him, and perchance I may think myself so much better than I am, as that they who are about me and see my state may have caused it to toll for me, and I know not that. The Church is Catholic, universal, so are all her actions. All that she does belongs to all. When she baptizes a child, that action concerns me, for that child is thereby connected to that body which is my head too, and ingrafted into that body whereof I am a member. And when she buries a man, that action concerns me. All mankind is of one author and is in one volume. When one man dies, one chapter is not torn out of the book, but translated into a better language, and every chapter must be so translated. God employs several translators. Some pieces are translated by age, some by sickness, some by war, some by justice, but God's hand is in every translation, and his hand shall bind up all our scattered leaves again for that library where every book shall lie open to one another.
And so there we are. We're all connected, and life is like a book. We're in one book. And one person dies, he uses the metaphor that he's translated. In some sense, that's a pun. You can translate things into different languages, but you can also be translated as in transported into this other realm. And he uses it kind of both ways. Some of us, he says, are translated by illness, and others by war, others by justice. But in every case, we are all translated by God's hands. And if we understand that, we can find peace in death, not just in our death, but in our translation.
As therefore the bell that rings to a sermon calls not upon the preacher only, but upon the congregation to come, so this bell calls us all. But how much more me, who am brought so near the door by the sickness? There was a contention as far as a suit in which both piety and dignity, religion and estimation were mingled, which of the religious orders should ring to prayers first in the morning, and it was determined that they should ring first that rose earliest. If we understand aright the dignity of this bell that tolls for our evening prayer, we would be glad to make it ours by rising early, in that application that it might be ours as well as his, who indeed it is. The bell doth toll for him that thinks it doth, and though it intermittent again, yet from that minute that occasion wrought upon him, he is united to God. Who casts not up his eye to the sun when it rises, but who takes off his eye from a comet when that breaks out? Who bends not his ear to any bell which upon any occasion rings, but who can remove it from the bell which is passing a piece of himself out of this world? No man is an island entire of itself. Every man is a piece of the continent, a part of the main. If a clod be washed away by the sea, Europe is the less, as well as if a promontory were, as well as if a manor of thy friends or of thine own were. Any man's death diminishes me, because I am involved in mankind, and therefore never send to know for whom the bell tolls. It tolls for thee. Neither can we call this a begging of misery, or a borrowing of misery, as though we were not miserable enough of ourselves, but must fetch in more from the next house in taking upon us the misery of our neighbors.
And there's that famous line, no man is an island. And therefore, because we are connected, we must take responsibility for each other. I am involved in mankind, and therefore never sin to know for whom the bell tolls. It tolls for thee. And here we have this phrase, he calls it, to take upon us the misery of our neighbors. There is incredible compassion here from a man who suffered much. And in this last paragraph, he tells us what he, at the end of his life, thinks of all of the suffering that he's experienced in his life. Let's listen to these final words.
Truly it were an excusable covetousness if we did, for affliction is a treasure, and scarce any man hath enough of it. No man hath affliction enough that is not matured and ripened by and made fit for God by that affliction. If a man carry treasure in bullion or in a wedge of gold, and have none coined into current money, his treasure will not defray him as he travels. Tribulation is a treasure in the nature of it, but it is not current money in the use of it, except we get nearer and nearer our home, heaven, by it. Another man may be sick too, and sick to death, and this affliction may lie in his bowels as gold in a mine, and be of no use to him. But this bell that tells me of his affliction digs out and applies that gold to me, if by this consideration of another's danger I take my own into contemplation, and so secure myself by making my recourse to my God, who is our only security.
You know, there's a lot to unpack there, but he's saying affliction is a treasure. There's a metaphor you don't hear very often.
No.
But he's going to make it work. Tribulation is treasure in God's economy. I mean, it's not current money. It's not money that you spend now, but it's currency in heaven. And God is the security. Tribulation makes us better people, so to speak. And in that sense, it is its own eternal reward. Dr. Donne has certainly come a long way when you see, how far he came from the old flea days of his youth. But I do feel the same restlessness in these latter works that you do feel. There's the energy and the passion. There's the same voice from those early days. 8 days before his actual death in 1631, Donne wrote, "Hymn to God, in my sickness." It's another metaphor. It's somewhat famous. He says, "Since I am coming to that holy room, where with thy choir of saints forevermore I shall be made thy music. As I come, I tune the instrument here at the door, and what I must do then, think here before."
In Isaac Walton's biography of Donne, he claims that Donne, in his dying days, insisted to personally modeling for a statue that would stand in St. Paul's Cathedral. He had a wooden pedestal made into the shape of an urn, and then he posed on it in a sheet. And according to Walton, he thus stood with his eyes shut, and with so much of the sheet turned aside as might show his lean, pale, and death-like face, which was purposely turned towards the east, from whence he expected the second coming of his and our Savior Jesus. So Donne dies March 31st, 1631. The statue was installed within 18 months of his death. In 1666, there was a great fire, and the story goes that the flames consumed the cathedral. The statue slid off its pedestal and torpedoed its way into the safety of the crypt.
It moved.
Yeah, so now before you smugly suggest that cannot possibly be true,
it was a thought.
You need to know this. Donne's statue is one of the few monumental figures to have survived the 1666 Great Fire of London. And today, if you visit St. Paul's Cathedral in London, you can visit him in the south choir aisle of the church and see that the only evidence of the fire is a scorch mark to the urn on which Donne stands.
Well, there you go. A man so interested in death, he identified with death. Could there be a more fitting finale that his statue survives the fire? And today he stands in that urn waiting for us to pay him a visit.
And so we hope you enjoyed our three-part discussion of this remarkable man, John Donne, the mock serious poet, the sincere lover, the impassioned preacher. Thank you for listening. And remember, our website is www.howtolovelitpodcast.com. It's where you can find links to all of our episodes as well as listening guides for most of them. And if you enjoyed this episode, please share this podcast with your friends who need to up their literature game. Also, please subscribe to our podcast on your app, or YouTube, or both. And if you enjoy what we do, give us a rating and a review. It's when you share the podcast that we grow. And as always, thank you for supporting us in our mission to make reading great literature accessible and enjoyable to as many people as possible.
Peace out.